So welcome to today's webinar on the topic of visual design and setting the standard for design leadership. I'm Frank Spillers, and I'm Chief Experience Officer and UX leader at Experience Dynamics. And I've been managing and working with visual designers for many, many years, acting in a capacity of creative direction and UX mentoring. And at Experience Dynamics, we have visual designers on our team. So a lot of the information that you're going to learn here today is based on our actual consulting work. And the material from this webinar actually comes from our Visual Design for UX training, which we're offering as an in-house or online training. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about visual design and more about visual design from a standpoint of process and how to develop compelling visual designs. You know, how do you get your visual designers, or if you're a visual designer, to that level of performance as an organization? You know, how do you leverage design in a leadership capacity? And so we're going to cover a UX manifesto, some things that you need to learn and apply, to your visual design efforts as an organization. And we'll talk about some techniques, 8 different compelling visual design techniques that you can leverage in order to get to, a standard of visual design that that we would call a leadership type role. Now, design is an interesting thing because it itself is perceived as something almost separate to UX, or sometimes perceived as something that is joined to UX. So we're gonna clarify and decouple visual design and UX design and what those things mean, and even how to test visual design. So the stats are really clear in terms of the research that's been done, that we're essentially making these 50 millisecond kind of precognitive impressions of a website. This is some research that was done, some scientific research that was published in Nature, the big scientific publication. Google did their own research, and they actually dropped it down to 17 milliseconds. So an incredibly quick, before the thought even hits the front of your brain, you do judge a visual design by, book by its cover. And so we know that good visual design can impact perceived ease of use and even intent to purchase. Design is hugely important. But we also know, and hold that thought, because here's the same information presented visually. And so just to reinforce the power, if you needed to be sold on the power of good visual design, we're seeing the use of fonts. We're seeing large kind of infographic-y kind of text. Some elements there grayed out. A human face, which has, there's a lot of psychology on the human face. A flat icon over here, material icon. Same information, but different display. Well, the but though is that, so visual design makes a difference, but here's what we're going to talk about is that we know that it's important, but when a user actually starts using a design, that's where you see designs fall down, and Microsoft, for example, has struggled with this for years. Many organizations have gone through this, where they create a really, sexy looking operating system, Vista and Windows 8 and so forth, looked really good, but when you started using it, didn't really work as expected. So that's the big but. You've got to have actual ease of use as well. So the question is, where does good UX design come from? A lot of people use the term interchangeably, visual design with UX design. In fact, a former client of mine who is a creative director and a brilliant designer, visual designer, went to art school, master of Photoshop and Illustrator. He just got a job as a senior UX designer at Amazon. And what I thought that was interesting about that is he has no experience in UX at all. So for me, that's a very high risk thing. You can't just Photoshop your way out of creating that, what happens after someone looks at your design, does that precognitive processing and then starts using it, right? It's like, how are you going to get to that? So depends how his, he's working with his team at Amazon. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today is what the process is to get there. But first of all, we know that good UX design comes from understanding user desires. The classic here is the ketchup bottle, and there are a lot of great images like this on the internet, that users like the squeezy bottle because, when they're putting ketchup on their burger or fries, or they can grab it and just kind of squeeze, and kids love it too. So UX is that desired use, how users are actually using it, and whereas UI is more the traditional bottle of, hey, here's your control, here's your container, good luck kind of thing. So understanding desires extremely important. The second thing, you may have seen this already, this really nice graphic showing the difference between design, nicely buttoned up sidewalk here, and then the user actually taking the footpath. So this, there's a lot of things you can interpret from this, like there's at least 3 or 4 things. But the one that I want to focus on today is the understanding of habits and expectations. Like, it's so important to understand that footpath in your design. What are those shortcuts? What are those things that people do habitually? In other words, what are those expectations they're bringing to the design? Maybe from other designs, maybe it's just an ingrained kind of, what we call a mental model, an expectation that's carried over. So getting that right is hugely important for good UX design. And then third of all is understanding context of use. This is a hilarious photo. I'm sure you've probably seen it before as well. And there are lots of similar photos on the internet that this, use of this mobile phone is for driving. So this is the guy's, cheap hands-free. And I think it's a joke. I think maybe a few people have done this, but understanding the context of use is hugely important. Quick story, a taxi driver was late to pick me up from the airport once. And I said to the guy, where were you? It's been forever. I almost got late. And he said, oh, I was just around the corner in a parking lot. And he said, what it is, they redesigned the system for the jobs, the queues, so this applies to dashboards, this applies to other projects you might be working on with where there's a job queue or like a list of things that a user needs to do. And he said like they had pushed it down, so it was buried down on 3 like menus away from his, he wanted to see, he was sitting in his car and he's ready to get the next job and he wanted to see it come up, and that was that's in a traditional taxi. Now Uber and Lyft and so forth have supplanted that, and that's kind of the main reason people use that, is so they have the status. Even though it's, the interesting thing about Uber and Lyft is it's a lie. I was almost late to catch my flight out of Heathrow not too long ago because I dialed up a Uber and it said it was a minute away, and then I waited 5 minutes, I waited 10 minutes, and the guy canceled, so I chose another car. It said it was 2 minutes away, and then it became 7 minutes and 9 minutes and 10 minutes. And so eventually it was 25 to 30 minutes delay to get what should have been, I was right down in central London. It should have been like a 2-minute, there were lots of cars. So I noticed that a lot. I'm sure you do too if you use Uber and Lyft, but it's interesting that why do we still use those apps? Is they support the context of our use, that we like the feeling, we like to pretend, I guess, that that it's 2 minutes away and that we know the status of the time, even though it's completely wrong. So some useful distinctions here of UX UI, right? There are lots of these nice images out there too, but the main point is that UI comes from, visual design, graphic design. It's about colors, it's about look and feel, iconography, branding, and UX, and it comes from context research, comes from that, understanding users' desires, understanding what they were doing in the first place, the problems they're trying to solve. So, the user research, the stories, the personas, all this stuff is in the user's life, in their emotional and social patterns, right? So when we use the term UX design, we're talking about both of these things, but it's it's a term that wasn't always used in the field. It's the common term now, UX UI or UX design, but UX design is a little misleading, especially for people hiring. So it's really important that you have a strong UX as part of your UX UI effort. So let's get into what your team needs to know, a manifesto for design leaders. First of all, is get clear about your organization's software and product development approach. Like really seriously get clear about that. Are you Photoshop driven or are you user-centered design driven? Right? Because visual design is about presentation layer. It's about really pixel perfect. I say with a pixelated icon of Photoshop on it right there. And user-centered design is about context-driven, desirability-driven, like what their wants and needs are in the first place. And this is all about task efficiency. That's how we measure usability, is by task efficiency. So it doesn't really have anything to do with pixel. So is your organization Photoshop or UCD? Or is it IT or UCD? A technology-driven is a system, component. It's about product defect. It's a focus on system robustness. Whereas again, UCD is workflow, scenario, task success. Again, task efficiency and success are the keys here. The second key is to define your UX strategy first, then your UI direction, right? So it's really important to dial that in. And how you do that is with a user-centered design set of activities. And that includes field studies, going out into the field, obsessing about your users, empathizing with them. Come back to your office and prototype that, and then go out and test again for validation. So it's really a user advocacy exercise that is occurring. And if your organization is user-centered design driven, you're doing these things and your visual designers are not having to carry the burden of doing UX, because just like my friend there that they got the job at Amazon, he doesn't have a background in UX. So how he's going to be expected to align those is going to be tough. It's really important when you're creating award-winning designs that you have a strong UX component, on the UX UI side of things. A lot of people try and deal with it just at the UI side of it, and it's a slippery slope. It's important to grow your UX efforts with user research, but why is it that your visual design team is bigger than your user research team and the budget? We know from stats that 60% of the time teams are not doing user research. Now, this is orthogonal to what people want. So if you talk to teams, they're like, oh yeah, we want to do user research, but in actuality, over half of teams are not doing that. And by user research, we're talking about field studies as much as usability testing. A lot of people use that term interchangeably. So usability testing, essential. Field studies and ethnography, user research, going out and observing users, going in their homes, their offices, and so forth. Super important. We've been brought in at Experience Dynamics to redesign things that creative agencies have designed. Totally different outcome. And it surprises me every time. And so I'm like, something's going on here. If you're a larger organization, this is critical. Okay, so this comes from our UX management class. We've just started teaching a UX management class. And one of the things that we teach in that class is your org chart, where your UX team is positioned, is critical, right? So your visual designer is going to be inside your UX team in most organizations. But imagine putting a marketer in the dev team. Wouldn't make any sense, So if you stick a visual designer in a dev team, for example, they can be co-opted by that system-driven, right, IT-driven, and that's why it's important to get clear about your approach to software development and to product development. The fourth one here is make design and product decisions based on user data. So you're moving away from opinions or company expertise and, or I would, I've been in so many design meetings where it's like, I would do this and I would do that. And instead we want to reference user behavior. So we observed users. It's evidence-based its user habits indicate this or that, so it's tempting to pretend you're the user and do the I would thing, but it's actually better for you, for your sanity and for your team sanity, if you're basing that on actual facts. So defining ROI and quality by how much UX you're actually doing, right? That's critical from a management perspective. And there are 3 ROI defining questions that you can ask. It's how much contact you're having with your users. Are you doing regular usability testing? And do you conduct field studies at least once per product, per project? This is critical to user-centered design. And this is, on average, not every single project or product would have this, but on the whole, this should be going on in your organization. And in the top performing, user-centered design organizations, this is going on regularly. So 8 techniques for creating compelling visual designs. The first one is to create a design language, which you probably already have, but test it. Test your UI standards. Make sure that it's specific to your UI. Don't rely on just internal hunches or, this plus button here, which is known to be a UI element. We immediately went to that on a recent web application, and we actually ditched it because we found that it wasn't intuitive in the context of this web application. So just because Gmail uses it, which is where we started, Gmail uses it, doesn't mean that we have to too. So flat design, but not too flat. My favorite example is Skype, the chat dialogue here. If you send somebody a link, they don't know to open the thing. So you can make this classic mistake that designers are making, which is hiding the affordances or these signifiers. The things that, so what should happen instead? Maybe this thing opens up and shows the chat message, automatically, or maybe it brings up a dialogue or some type of indicator that says, hey, this is, or a bubble here with a live event. I've been on so many Skype calls over the years where you go, I just sent you a link on the Skype chat, and the person goes, where, what, where, it happens every time. And these are Skype users as well. This is business, So we know that you can be so flat that you can wipe out your UI. So always be user testing, after visual design. So this is a mistake that I've made over the years, which is usability test before pre-design, pre-visual design in the wireframe stage, which is common for usability, activity. And what we often forget to do is test after the visual design hits, because some of those affordances might go away, and so that's important. Doing A/B testing and tweaking conversions if it's appropriate to your app or your site is really important. And if you can't do that, then follow-up user testing or a diary study. Diary study is a technique that can help you pick up after effects. If you're not sure what that is, you can Google that. I think on the Experience Dynamics website, we have an article you can search in there about a diary study. Visual design follows task support, number 5. So you can't design good visual design if you don't know what the tasks are. So preferably validating those from those field studies, right? We're just designing a system, not this one, but this is a pattern, things on the left here, but there's a lot to digest. It's like an icon factory over here on the left. You see that, and then there's the slide out here. So we actually decided to tweak this to simplify this and then change these into one word. These were like 2-3 word navigation on the design that we were working on to make it easier, because we've seen in user testing that users struggle with that. Let's go to 6. Journey maps help you map flow. So flow is this thing that dictates screen layout and call to actions, key design directions. So mapping the journey, it can be a very helpful way for you, even though that's not necessarily considered visual design activity. As a UX designer, mapping your journey can really help focus. Why are we starting on the screen? Why is the add button, a huge square button instead of the subtle round one that's floating in the bottom right corner of the screen and doesn't look right, in a web app or something, as we found. The seventh one here is don't be afraid to break UI boundaries. But, right, did I just say that? I mean, this is not something that UX people say very often. And what I wanted to say is, that you can innovate. There are innovative UIs, and Google does a lot of this, but Google also validates, and, they'll do quantitative testing where they'll send out a UI to 500,000 users over the weekend, come back on Monday, look at the data and see which one performed better. So they'll do like A/B type or multivariate type testing. But usability testing can get you there as well if it's not appropriate for you to do that, or if you don't have 500,000 users like that to test with. It's also important not to be careful not to copy from other apps without testing, and how you implement is hugely critical. There's a lot of UI elements we've seen and used over the years, and then they don't get implemented the way that they should be implemented. So, but breaking boundaries is okay. It's okay to do that. One of my favorite hamburger menus, so the hamburger menu is notoriously unusable. Users don't see it. That's a good example of, clean, it's too clean, or the affordance isn't there. So the research shows that putting a square around it, but one of my favorites, which is a pattern breaker, is pulsating and kind of moves along the screen. It kind of sits in the bottom right corner, and it's the hamburger, but it's kind of pulsating a little. So you're starting to see more of that type of visual design, which I consider as excellent. Animations, motion graphics, hugely important. So the final eighth one here is to engage stakeholders early on. That it's really important to change your process, like add a new rule. And this is like for directors or leaders of teams. You're going to have to force this in your organization, because stakeholders, business teams, will ask for eye candy. Visual designers, I once heard a team saying they had a UX team, and there was a visual designer, and they said, a senior VP of product said, "This is the woman who does all the pretty pictures." That's how they described a visual designer, And this particular woman actually went and got a degree in usability, and actually is a user researcher now, is her primary role. So she actually transitioned from visual designer over to user research, kind of got some justice on the woman who makes pretty pictures. So for me, non-negotiable standards for quality, creativity, and user experience. I've given you some tips, some hints about that already. Breaking patterns, yeah, sure. If it makes sense, why not? The key here, and where I set the bar, is usable, visually delightful, and accessible. For years, Jacob Nielsen, would justify why his website was not visually designed, and still, doesn't use a lot of visual design. And I think a lot of that was about load times, but a lot of it was personal taste. I think visual design, as we've seen from the research, makes an impact. Creative people, designers know this, marketers know this. So that it's okay, though, and it's possible to marry both ease of use and visual delight, as well as accessibility, right? So there's a belief that, similarly to load time, that, if it's accessible, it's got to be bare bones and I can't make it beautiful. Well, that's not true. You can have ease of use, and then you can have joy of use, which is emotion. So there are two techniques which are critical for stakeholder engagement. The first one is running design thinking workshops. So design thinking can be a great way to bring your team together, and actually they get to experience the full UCD, user-centered design process. And this can help you move your UX process to the next level, right? So they actually get to feel what it's like to interview, to prototype, and to test, essentially inside of 3 hours. Design studios, so this is a lean UX technique, help you get your UI to the next level. And we've used these in almost every project now, where we bring stakeholders together, and visual designers are in there too, and so they're part of the process of concepting. Bring the field data in, and then work together to come up with sketches. And people that don't sketch do fine, actually. So it's a nice technique, the design studio. If you're not using it, you should. It's a helpful way to bring stakeholders together, and I think that's how you get to quality. You get to quality through good process and through stakeholder engagement, right? Not just the visual designer sitting off in the corner creating pretty pictures. So I've talked about the importance of data. I've talked about the importance of evidence-based and understanding your users' tasks and understanding the context is critical to UX design and the need for strong UX as well as UI, not just all in the UI and the eye candy. And one of the things similar to A/B testing in terms of validation is providing some measurement to your visual design, because it's so subjective. The problem with visual design is it's super subjective for users and for internal stakeholders. And so you end up being this, like order taker as a designer in a large organization. You end up, instead of like focusing on good UX design, you end up being a tool, and you're moving the button here because this person said, and you're changing the color there because that person liked, and this VP came in and this, and this, all that kind of thing. When Steve Jobs did that at Apple, and Jonathan Ives is, Jonathan Ives is a designer. Steve Jobs wasn't, but Steve Jobs pushed his team in the early 80s towards UX, towards user friendliness, as it was called, towards user experience. He pushed his team because he said it's not intuitive enough. So he always advocated for usability as well as good visual design, always. So there are 3 ways that we test and kind of quantify the design. The first one is emotional measurement. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the thing about emotional measurement, it's not, do you like this? Does this look good? Which is market research and how traditional creative agencies validate designs. And that's just drinking your own Kool-Aid. It's not empirical enough for me. It's not objective enough, if you will. And so the research has found that if you measure non-verbally, don't ask people what they think, have them use, a non-verbal scale, if you will. And that's what we use. You can find that. Now, eye tracking is also good, bringing hard science. You can see gaze plots. You can see where people are fixating, and you can the classic heat map and actually bring some quantification. And then usability testing, as we talked about. And remember, lo-fi is the UI prototype. When you're in that early on pre-design stage, and high fidelity would be once you've tested. After that stage. After the design is done, the visual design is done. So remember, we talked about the importance of that. So let's talk a little bit about joy of use and emotional measurement. So joy of use, this is the grandfather of user-centered design, Don Norman. He said, I think with his book, it was around 2004, I think it was 3-4. He said he finally had a breakthrough from usability. Now he was going to focus on emotion, and that was a good thing. So emotion has been part of the formally on the agenda for usability. It hasn't quite made its way into agile teams and corporate environments, or even amongst usability professionals. There are very few UX people that actually measure emotion. A lot of people don't even know you can. But to keep your users in a good mood, to have them smiling, to me, this is what you take to the bank. If your users are satisfied, the word of mouth goes up, satisfaction, return, time on site, whatever, all these metrics that you can use, and of course, more usable, less friction. So emotional measurement uses a set of cartoons that are scientifically validated, cross-culturally validated, and they make a sound and they make a body language, because the research shows that to measure emotion, you have to activate that, essentially body language, and face is where all the research has been done on emotions. And so there's a large body of practice with product emotions. And so we do emotion measurement at Experience Dynamics. And this is an example of some icons that we were validating from one of our clients. And what they were able to do is take all their kind of internal arguing about which direction they should go in, which style of icon. They had like 3 or 4 different types of flat design and with different levels of intuitiveness. So we usability tested it and then added the emotional measurement as well. And we were able to provide a score, based on, there are like 9 different emotional reactions. And then so you can quantify how someone, whether someone hates or likes or, their range of emotions, and they're all linked back to scientific validation, right? So I really like that approach to visual design, because not only can usability and eye tracking give you the validation of your UX, but for your UI, for your visual design, you can get that validation through emotion measurement, and that's nice to have that as well. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I think we are out of time, but I will hang around for a little bit here, stay on the line. Thanks for attending, and hope to see you on a future webinar.